World History of Christianity, Chapter 3. We're beginning on page 81 at the revival of monasticism and the patriarchate of Photios. The second half of the 9th century was characterized by increasing tension between two opposing parties within the church, the secular clergy, headed by Methodios, and the monastic party, which, owing to its association with the defense of orthodoxy during the iconoclast period, had become increasingly influential and vociferous, regarding themselves, perhaps, as the guardians of orthodox doctrine and canon law par excellence. The monastic group, led by monks associated with the monastery of Studios in Constantinople, opposed many of the appointments and decisions enacted by the Patriarch Methodios. In return, he insisted that they repudiate many of the writings of their spiritual leader, Theodore, against the policies of the earlier patriarchs, Tarasios and Nikephoros. When they refused, he anathematized them. This conflict remained unresolved until Methodios was eventually forced to retire and was replaced as patriarch by Ignatius, a strong supporter of the monastic party. It is generally accepted that, partly as a result of the overthrow of iconoclasm and monastic association with this victory, monasticism entered a period of rapid expansion in the mid-9th century. Many different forms of religious life were available in this period, catering for every sector of the population. Hermits could live in desolate places, such as on mountain tops or deserts, following the way of life adopted by early ascetics, such as Saint Anthony, whereas groups of monks could follow the cenobitic life advocated by Pachomius, Basil the Great, and most recently Theodore of Studios. Between these two extremes existed many variations. It was common for a cenobitic house in the 9th century, for example, to have an anchorite or two under its protection. Saints' lives of the period suggest that abbots, or higumenioi, were responsible for guiding monks towards the goal of solitude, hesychia, or alternatively, recommending the communal life. The reforms in cenobitic monasticism introduced by Theodore into the monastery of Studios and its daughter houses seem to have included changes in liturgical observances. Some of these reflected the influence of Palestinian monasteries, especially the monastery of St. Sabas. The morning and evening offices, esperinos, vespers, and orthros, matins, were lengthened by the addition of new hymnographic material, and all-night vigils were introduced into Constantinopolitan monasteries. Thus, a monastic liturgical office developed, parallel to the existing tradition of the cathedral office. These two traditions coexisted in Constantinople and surrounding regions until the Latin conquest of Constantinople in 1204. When the Patriarch Ignatius was eventually deposed in 858 for attempting to play too influential a role in the political life of the palace, he was replaced by the cultured layman and civil servant Photios. It was during the Patriarchate of Photios that two key events in 9th century Byzantine church history occurred: the beginnings of schism with Rome and the first Orthodox missions to the Slavs. The causes of disagreement with the Pope were initially political, when he refused to authorize Ignatius's resignation and to recognize the ordination of Photios as Patriarch of Constantinople. Photios, however, widened the discussion to include a doctrinal issue, namely the acceptance by Rome of an addition into the creed of the words "and the Son" in the clause describing the procession of the Holy Spirit. Whereas the papacy had not yet approved the inclusion of the clause, known as the Filioque, in the churches of Rome in this period, it did overlook its use in Frankish and other Western churches. Photios wrote a letter to the Pope in which he attacked his acceptance of the Filioque and outlined its heretical implications. In stating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, the Revised Creed appears to admit two principles or sources of creation. In 867, after an exchange of hostile letters, Photios held a synod in Constantinople in which he deposed and anathematized Pope Nicholas II. 9th century missions to the Slavs and the emergence of the Slavic churches. Tension concerning ecclesiastical jurisdiction in Illyricum and rivalry over missions to the Slavs had in fact precipitated the conflicts between Photios and Pope Nicholas II. The papal jurisdiction of Illyricum, which had been removed by the iconoclast emperors in the 8th century, was one of the powers which Nicholas II had hoped to recover in his diplomatic embassies to Constantinople. Owing to their other disagreements, Photios refused to consider this request, thereby further infuriating the Pope. Rivalry over the form of Christianity adopted by the Bulgarian Khan Boris, who had been baptized by the Greeks in 864, but remained subject to the influence of Latin missionaries in the region, also contributed to the discord between Rome and Constantinople during Photios's first patriarchate, 858 through 867. Taking place at roughly the same time as the conversion of the Bulgarian Khan to Christianity were the missions to the Slavs in Moravia. Photios appears to have regarded Christian mission, and in particular Byzantine Orthodox mission, as one of his most important patriarchal duties. The fact that the conversion of alien peoples, such as the Slavs, furthered the expansionist aims of the Byzantine Empire in this period must have contributed to the patriarch's enthusiasm. Photios found able and enthusiastic agents for his missions in two brothers from Thessalonica, Constantine, later Cyril, and Methodios. Constantine, sometimes called the philosopher, was an outstanding philologist and scholar, besides being a skilled theologian. His brother, Methodios, had been governor of a region near Thessalonica and was an obvious choice for his companion. The first mission on which the brothers embarked was to distant Khazaria in the northern Caucasus. The Khazars had already converted to Judaism during the 8th century, but Photios must have hoped that this might render them receptive to the teachings of Christianity. The mission was a failure, however, and after this Byzantine attention turned to the Slavs in the north. In 862, Ratislav, the ruler of Great Moravia, wrote to the Byzantine Emperor Michael III, asking for a teacher to give Christian instruction to his people in his own language. Up until this time, missionaries from the East Franks, Germans, had been working in the area, but their church services were all celebrated in Latin. It was Constantine and Methodios, both fluent in the language because of their contact with Slavs settled in and around Thessalonica, who conceived the idea of inventing an alphabet and translating the scriptures and Orthodox liturgical texts into Slavonic. The mission to Moravia was ultimately unsuccessful due to the opposition of the German missionaries already in residence there. Although the two Greek missionaries appealed to the Pope for protection and were granted his blessing, this proved ineffectual. While Constantine died in Rome in 869 after entering a monastery and taking the name of Cyril, Methodius, on returning to Moravia, was imprisoned for a short time and subjected thereafter to continuous harassment. After his death in 885, Methodius's followers were either driven out of Moravia or sold into slavery. The methods which Constantine and Methodius adopted in their missions to the Slavs were nevertheless to have a lasting impact on all the other Slavic churches. Whereas the mission to Moravia had been unsuccessful, other churches in the Balkans and in Rus took over the translation of Greek liturgical texts into Slavonic. The Glagolitic alphabet, invented by Constantine and also employed by his successors Clement and Naum, who worked first at the court of the Bulgarian ruler Simeon, 893 to 927, and later in Macedonia, gave way slowly to the simpler Cyrillic one, which was based mainly on Greek letters. After the Orthodox baptism of the Bulgarian Khan Boris in 1864, he became dissatisfied with the Greeks for refusing to grant autonomy to his national church. After a brief period in which he allowed Latin missionaries into Bulgaria in the hope of gaining more favorable terms from Rome, Boris eventually turned back to the Byzantines. In March 870, a church council placed Bulgaria under the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and Boris expelled the remaining Western missionaries from the nation. In consequence, the Bulgarian ruler welcomed the disciples of Constantine and Methodius who had been forced to leave their mission in Moravia. They at once introduced their Slavonic translations of the liturgy and the scriptures into the churches of Bulgaria, and thereby helped to lay the foundations of a Slavic Christian culture. Boris's third son, Simeon, was educated in Constantinople for an ecclesiastical career, but was recalled in 893 to replace his brother Vladimir as Prince of Bulgaria. While Simeon's education and exposure to Orthodox Christianity in Constantinople meant that he was a strong supporter of the nascent Bulgarian church, he was also an ambitious political leader who hoped to conquer Constantinople and became emperor of the Greeks and the Bulgarians. In spite of the hostility between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians during Simeon's reign, 893 to 927, this was a period in which Orthodox Christianity flourished and spread in Bulgaria. In 927, the Bulgarian Church was at last granted autonomy by the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Byzantine missionaries also went to Serbia in the second half of the 9th century, and many Serbs were converted to Orthodoxy between 867 and 874. It is probably due to influence from Bulgaria that Slavonic service books were introduced early, thereby strengthening local allegiance to the new religion. Although Serbia remained under the jurisdiction of Constantinople until 1219, when Saint Sava was consecrated archbishop of a semi-autonomous Serbian church, it early developed its own distinctive culture, which was manifested in religious art and literature. After taking over most of the liturgical and patristic texts translated by Constantine and Methodius and their successors, the Serbs made further translations of biblical commentaries, homilies, and mystical texts. The greatest flowering of Serbian culture took place during the reign of King Stefan Nemanja, 1165 through 96, and his successors. There can be no doubt that the use of the vernacular language also played a part in the conversion of the Princess Olga in Kiev and her grandson Vladimir, the first Christian ruler of the Rus in the middle and late decades of the 9th century. Before discussing these conversions, however, it is necessary to provide some background on the emergence of the Rus and the Varangians, who ruled over them for a period and later were absorbed into Slavic society. According to the earliest document on this subject, the Primary Chronicle, the Varangians pushed southwards from Scandinavia and settled in the region around Novgorod in the mid-9th century. Elements of this group traveled further south around 856, and seizing the district of Kiev on the way, reached Constantinople in 860 and laid siege to the city. The Patriarch Photios delivered 2 homilies on the occasion of this siege. It was the successors of the Varangians and the Rus remaining in the region of Kiev who came to be influenced by the religious beliefs of the Byzantines. In 957, Olga, regent for her son Svyatoslav, paid a ceremonial visit to Constantinople. Here she seems to have been granted a cordial reception and to have been welcomed into the court. It is not clear whether she was baptized on this occasion or whether she had already embraced Christianity in Kiev, but in any case she returned to her native land, determined to win more converts to Orthodoxy. Olga failed to persuade her son Svyatoslav to be baptized, but a generation later, in 988, her grandson Vladimir became a Christian. The passage from the Primary Chronicle describing the delight of Vladimir's envoys on beholding the liturgical celebrations in Constantinople's great church was quoted at the beginning of this chapter. It forms part of the writer's account of the Kievan ruler's conversion to Orthodoxy. More pragmatic reasons for his baptism may include the Byzantine Emperor Basil II's desire for an ally in his efforts to quell a rebellious uprising, and Vladimir's own desire for an imperial bride, Basil II's sister Anna. Whatever the actual causes of Vladimir's adoption of Christianity, it is clear that the conversion of his people followed relatively quickly. From this time onwards, Kievan Christianity remained closely linked to its mother church in Constantinople. Not only did it receive from Byzantium the riches of Orthodox religious art and literature, but it was also influenced by the Greek monastic tradition, in particular that of the eremitical ascetics. The early period in Russian history, called the Kievan period, lasted from 988 to the early 13th century, when the Mongols invaded and seized control. This represents in many ways an attractive start to the history of the Russian Church, since Vladimir and his successors seem to have taken the ethical teachings of Christianity seriously. Whenever Vladimir feasted with his court, food was also distributed to the poor and sick. It is possible that nowhere else in medieval Europe were there such highly organized social services as in 10th century Kiev. Vladimir also abolished capital punishment, and his sons Boris, Gleb, and Svyatoslav chose to be killed rather than to take up arms against their relation Svyatopolk when he seized power. All of these figures are still revered in the Russian Church as saints and passion bearers. The 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. The so-called Tetragamy crisis dominates Byzantine church history in the early 10th century. This debate was important because it revealed the willingness of the Constantinopolitan Synod of Bishops to uphold Byzantine canon law against the wishes of the emperor, and because it represented one more occasion on which he appealed to Rome for support against his own ecclesiastical hierarchs. The background to the controversy was as follows. Leo VI, Byzantine emperor between 886 and 912, became worried that he had not been provided with a legitimate male heir. His first wife, the pious Theophano, died in 893, and he took a second wife, Zoe, who also died without male issue in 899. According to Byzantine canon law, 2 imperial marriages were acceptable, if not totally approved. A third and a fourth marriage were positively prohibited. Any offspring of such marriages should be considered illegitimate. Undeterred by canonical rulings, Leo married a third wife, Eudocia Bain, and when she died in childbirth in 901, he took a mistress, Zoe Carbonopsina. Her son, Constantine, was actually born in the palace, or as the Byzantines put it, in the purple. Controversy erupted first when the patriarch Nicholas I Mysticos agreed to baptize the baby in the great church on the feast of Epiphany, 6 January 906. According to Nicholas himself, who wrote a letter justifying his action to Pope Anastasius III, he performed the baptism on condition that Leo would separate himself from his mistress Zoe immediately. Instead, probably around Easter 906, Leo and Zoe were secretly married by a priest called Thomas, and Zoe was crowned Augusta by the emperor himself. Significantly, the Byzantine Synod of Bishops and the Patriarch were united in their condemnation of the emperor's actions. Leo was forbidden entry to the great church, and his wife's name was not added to the diptychs. The emperor decided to appeal to the 4 other members of the Pentarchy, the 3 Eastern Patriarchates, and the Pope in Rome for a special dispensation. This was forthcoming, and papal legates arrived in Constantinople in 907. The hierarchs who remained opposed to Leo's marriage, including the Patriarch Nicholas, were deposed and exiled to monasteries. Even Nicholas's successor, Euthemios, however, refused to acknowledge Leo's marriage, and he proceeded to depose the priest who had performed the ceremony. Eventually, after the death of Leo VI in 1912, Nicholas Mystikos was returned to office, and the whole affair was to some extent resolved. Constantinople's influence that a 4th marriage should be utterly banned by canon law was acknowledged by Rome, whose support, along with that of the other 3 patriarchates, was still seen to be necessary. Another of the achievements of the brilliant and forceful patriarch Nicholas I Mystikos was his attempt at diplomatic negotiations with the Bulgarian ruler Simeon in the early 10th century. The letters which the patriarch sent to Simeon after 1912 reveal that Nicholas sought to direct the Bulgarian ruler's ambition for the Byzantine throne into peaceful channels, suggesting an alliance by imperial marriage. Nicholas's diplomatic efforts were unsuccessful due to the misguided intervention of the Empress Zoe, but his vision of a peace based on the common faith of the Byzantines and the Bulgarians represents a fine example of the perceived link between diplomacy and Christian mission in the Middle Byzantine period. Monasteries, both privately and imperially owned, continued to increase and to expand in the 10th century. Not only the reigning imperial family, but also the nobility and even ordinary civilians perceived donations to monasteries as a useful way to invest their money. If a family had no heir apparent, bequeathing land to an existing house or even founding a new monastery ensured that it would remain intact. with the added advantage that the family or individual donor would gain spiritual credit. The donor could compose his own testament and monastic rule, or typicon, both of which might enumerate not only his long-standing virtues, but also his formal renunciation of any remaining transgressions. Prayers of intercession for the individual or family could be demanded of the monks in perpetuity. As monastic houses acquired land and movable property, it became a primary concern for them to safeguard their ownership by law. In the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, the legal terms on which monasteries held their lands became increasingly complex. At the same time, a succession of emperors felt impelled to enact legislation aimed at restricting the power of monasteries and at preventing their further acquisition of land to the detriment of imperial revenues. The fact that such legislation was frequently overruled or at least modified shows how unpopular such measures were, even in the eyes of the emperors who were forced to promote them. To begin with the various obligations of monastic founders, canon law initiated in the 4th and 5th centuries and updated in the late 9th states that donors and their families must see that building work is completed within 3 years of the foundation of churches and monasteries. If they fail to achieve this, the leading men, archontes, of their neighborhood should compel them to complete their work. Furthermore, the descendants of donors are responsible for completing or carrying out maintenance on foundations. The need for such laws stems from the long-standing existence in the Byzantine Empire of private monasteries. These foundations continued to be viewed as private property and were not subject to episcopal or imperial authority. In addition to their legal exemptions, monastic foundations deprived the imperial treasury of tax revenues since their land frequently remained uncultivated. The mechanism of charistike, or the legal grant of a monastery into the ownership of a layman who might thereafter receive all its revenues, represented another drain on the resources of the central government. Much of the imperial legislation enacted in the 10th century is aimed at preventing the further acquisition of land by monasteries and the consequent dispossession of peasants. In 934, the Emperor Romanos Lecapenus issued a law which forbade wealthy individuals, including lay magnates and abbots, from acquiring more land at the expense of peasants. Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos, reconfirmed these restrictions in 947, and in 964, Nikephoros II Phocas banned all new foundations of monasteries and philanthropic institutions. Throughout this edict, perhaps in order to emphasize its moral underpinning, the emperor stresses the distinction between monastic founders' justifiable concern to ensure the survival of their houses and the avarice which led some to accumulate excessive amounts of property. He also deplores the large number of new monasteries currently being founded and the state of disrepair into which many existing foundations have fallen. In 988, however, the Emperor Basil II repealed Nikephoros' law. This was perhaps a concession to the wishes of the landed magnates, whose support he needed to gain. Subsequent laws reverted to the old practice of favoring monasteries and their wealthy founders. By the reign of Alexios I Komnenos, 1081 to 1118, tradition and spiritual considerations seem to have prevailed over the recognition that the privileges of the monasteries were inexorably depleting the resources of the state. The fact that monastic foundations retained so many rights and exemptions in spite of their negative effect on the imperial government in economic terms testifies to the extent of their influence in Byzantine society throughout these centuries. One of the most famous monastic foundations of the 10th century was that of the great Lavra Monastery on Mount Athos by Saint Athanasius the Athonite. Mount Athos, an isolated and mountainous projection of the Chalkidike Peninsula in northern Greece, had been inhabited by hermits from about the late 8th century. Like other holy mountains in Asia Minor, such as Mounts Ida, Latros, Auxentios, and Olympos, Mount Athos represented a refuge from the world which was seen as closer to God. Saint Athanasius, who was seen even by his own contemporaries as an innovator, transformed the monastic life on Mount Athos from one of solitude to Cenobitic monasticism. It should be noted, however, that he himself saw no opposition between the two ways of life. His own typikon, or rule, for the monastery allows for hesychasts, or those who wish to pursue a solitary existence, to live within the great Lavra. Of all the Byzantine holy mountains, Mount Athos is the most important because it remains to the present day, with a total of about 20 working monasteries, and because monastic documents dating back to the Byzantine period survive in its libraries, providing valuable information concerning the monastery's property, legal affairs, and many other matters. It is also in this century that one of the great mystical fathers of the Orthodox Church, Saint Simeon the New Theologian, lived and wrote his spiritual treatises. Born in Paphlagonia in the mid-10th century, Simeon began his monastic life at the monastery of Studios in Constantinople under his spiritual father, Simeon Eulabes. He then moved to the monastery of St. Mamas, where he was appointed abbot sometime between 979 and 991. Owing to the policies of reform which he imposed on his monastery, Simeon's monks rebelled, and he was forced to resign, although he eventually gained permission to found a new monastery, called St. Marina, near the capital city. In his writings, Simeon promoted the idea that individuals can follow their own path to salvation through strict asceticism and prayer under the guidance of a spiritual leader. Simeon himself experienced mystical visions of God at various times in his life, which he describes as appearances of divine light. Simeon's stress on direct experience of God as the heart of theology represents an intensely personal vision, but also grows out of a spiritual tradition based in the early monasticism of the Byzantine Empire. The emperors Nikephoros II Phocas, 963 to 969, John I Thimiskes, 969 to 976, and Basil II, 976 to 1025, were jointly responsible for a period of military reconquest and political stability in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. In the east, parts of Syria, including Antioch, southeast Anatolia, and most of Armenia, were recaptured for the Eastern Roman Empire. Nikephoros Phocas regarded war against the Muslims as a holy war. He decreed that all Christians who fell fighting Arabs should be declared martyrs. Byzantine efforts to convert conquered Muslims to Christianity seem on the whole to have been unsuccessful. On the other hand, the recovery of territories in the east led to renewed contact with monophysites, especially the Jacobite, Syrian, and Armenian churches. After the depopulation of enormous tracts of land in Cilicia and Armenia due to Byzantine military advances, monophysite Christians were encouraged to expand into the newly instituted themes. They moved into many parts of northern Syria, and southeast Anatolia, and were allowed to establish new non-Chalcedonian bishoprics. The imperial acceptance of heterodoxy within the empire was without precedent and was strongly opposed both by ecclesiastics in Constantinople and by local Chalcedonian minorities. Nevertheless, the policy did ensure the repopulation and continued defense of these frontier regions. When it was reversed by a succession of empires after 1028, the consequences were disastrous. After the military advances of the 10th century, the 11th was dominated by political power struggles and a succession of weak rulers. The main contenders for the imperial throne came from two very different backgrounds: landed families based in Asia Minor or Europe, and a well-connected class of civil servants in Constantinople. It is possible that territorial expansion led to a false sense of security, and that a number of imperial policies, including the replacement of military service by taxation, the failure to establish adequate frontier protection, and the neglect of the fleet, were to begin the long process of Byzantium's decline. In addition, the Eastern Roman Empire was now at risk from a number of external enemies, whose appearance could not have been predicted. In the east, Turkish tribes were establishing themselves in many of the frontier regions so recently won back by the Byzantines. Their method of military attack was to make frequent raids into Roman territory. Contemporary sources suggest that the imperial government failed to adopt adequate measures to repel these invaders. In the north and west, Slavic states under Byzantine rule were becoming increasingly rebellious. Although most of these peoples had by now adopted Orthodoxy as their religion, they continued to play off Greek against Latin ecclesiastical authority. Further north, other Turkic tribes, including the Pechenegs, were becoming troublesome. The traditional Byzantine method of controlling neighboring peoples by diplomacy or bribery was no longer proving effective. It is against the background of the growing power of the Normans and the Germans in the West during this period that increasing tension between the ecclesiastical sees of Constantinople and Rome should be placed. At the same time, differences in cultural and religious outlook contributed to their separation. We have seen how political tensions centering on the issue of papal authority had begun as early as the 7th century as a result of the monothelite and iconoclast controversies. The immediate cause of conflict in the 11th century, however, was the dispute concerning sovereignty in southern Italy and the threat of a Norman invasion. Both Rome and Constantinople saw the need for political unity in this area, but it soon became apparent that they were unable to agree on a number of doctrinal and practical matters. The main topics of debate were the Western inclusion of the word filioque in the Creed, an addition which implied the double procession of the Holy Spirit, the Roman prohibition against married clergy, and its use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist. The Byzantines saw all these practices as unnecessary innovations and argued passionately against their acceptance. There can be no doubt that the personalities of the leading contenders in this debate contributed to its bitterness. In Rome, Pope Leo IX, who belonged to a growing party of reformers, was backed by the uncompromising Cardinal Humbert. In Constantinople, the Patriarch Michael Carularios, 1043-58, proved to be an equally redoubtable defender of what he regarded as correct church doctrine and practice. With the addition of a relatively weak emperor, Constantine IX, dispute between the two churches became inevitable. The sequence of events was as follows. In 1054, papal legates brought 2 letters from the Pope to the Patriarch in Constantinople. This embassy was led by Humbert, the Pope's chief advisor, who had been prominent in recent efforts to cleanse the Western Church from the errors of simony and other forms of corruption. When the legates arrived in Constantinople in April 1054, they were well received by the emperor, but denied access to the Patriarch Carularios. Frustrated and angered by the Patriarch's unyielding attitude, Humbert left a bull on the altar of the great church on 16 July, excommunicating the Patriarch and all his associates. The Latin delegation then left Constantinople, having parted on friendly terms with the emperor. When Constantine learned of the bull of excommunication, however, he recalled the Roman legates so that they might debate the contentious issues with the Patriarch. Then, fearing for their physical safety at the hands of Carularios' followers, he hastily dismissed them again. When the Synod of Constantinopolitan bishops met, it drew up a document which refuted the charge of heresy brought against Carularios. The Patriarch further argued that the papal legates were impostors and that their letters had been tampered with en route. In his subsequent correspondence with impartial bystanders such as Peter III, Patriarch of Antioch, it is clear that Carularios exaggerated the charges brought by the Latin legates, and that he suggested that they revealed an unprecedented attempt at papal supremacy. Whereas many of his correspondents, including Peter of Antioch, Theophylact of Ochrid, and others, urged Carularios to forget the matter and to show tolerance and understanding, the Patriarch appears to have refused. The significance of the events of 1054 were certainly not recognized at the time, and have perhaps been exaggerated by posterity. Excommunications of particular patriarchs or popes by either see had occurred before and later been healed. The dispute between Pope Leo IX and Patriarch Michael Carularios represents only one incident in a process of cultural and political separation which had begun much earlier. The lack of mutual trust and understanding between Latins and Greeks became completely evident in the events of the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople by the Latins in 1204. Historians have rightly pointed to this as the true date of the schism, rather than to the largely personal misunderstandings of 1054. Another feature of 11th century imperial policy was a renewal of persecution by monophysite Christians. This represented an unfortunate reversal of the more tolerant policies of the previous century, and the result was to weaken support for Byzantine imperial rule in outlying territories, such as Armenia and Eastern Asia Minor. The Patriarch, John Exiphilinus, 1064 to 75, a highly educated and otherwise enlightened religious leader, undertook to drive out monophysite influence within the empire. In 1064 and 1065, Exiphilinus summoned various monophysite hierarchs to Constantinople for questioning, including both secular and religious leaders of the Armenians. Such measures intensified the Armenians' long-standing religious and ethnic prejudices toward the Greeks and fatally weakened Byzantine support in their territories. Further repression of heterodox beliefs within the Orthodox Church may be seen in the trials which took place in the late 11th century under the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. The first of these trials involved John Italos, a teacher who employed philosophy as a tool for the study of theological doctrine. Italos was the student of the better-known scholar and writer Michael Physelos, who had himself been questioned on one occasion, but who had defended himself with a formal profession of faith. For both men, as for earlier patristic thinkers, pagan philosophy, especially the writings of Plato and his Neoplatonist followers, represented a resource which could be used in conjunction with theology, provided, of course, that it did not conflict with the teachings of Christianity. In the highly charged atmosphere of late 11th century Constantinople, however, classical humanism was equated with heresy. John Italos does not appear to have been as adept as Physelos in refuting the charges brought against him, whereas the first trial in 1076 through 77 did not mention his name and only condemned various teachings. The second, held in 1082, found him guilty and forced him to retire into a monastery. In evaluating the significance of the second and final trial of John Italos, it is important to emphasize its connection with a deliberate imperial policy on the part of Alexios I Komnenos. Alexios' intention was to reassert the importance of a strong and unified Orthodox Church for the Byzantine polity. His choice of the Feast of Orthodoxy, the first Sunday of Lent, which commemorates the final overthrow of iconoclasm in 843, for the condemnation of Italos was deliberate. The philosopher's dangerous heterodoxy could in this way be associated officially with the earlier heresies, especially iconoclasm, which had threatened the church. The anathemas against Italos were added to the official document which was read out annually in church to commemorate the restorations of icons in 843, the Synodicon of Orthodoxy. Whereas this document had remained relatively unchanged since that date, it was during and after the reign of Alexios that more heresies began to be added to it. Thus, the Synodicon became for the Byzantines, in the absence of further ecumenical councils, an authoritative statement of right belief. The trial and condemnation of John Italos also had an effect on Byzantine church-state relations thereafter. By promoting the established church at the expense of independent theologians and philosophers such as Italos, the Emperor Alexios reinforced the power and influence of the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate. Alexios I Komnenos also had other heresies with which to contend, including the dualist sect of the Bogomils. Bogomilism probably originated in 10th century Bulgaria, and it seems to have appealed to disaffected subjects of the Byzantine Orthodox Commonwealth. Drawing on the Gnostic belief that the material world is the creation of the devil, the Bogomils denied the basic doctrines of the Orthodox Church, including the incarnation of Christ. They imposed, at least on a group of selected initiates, an ascetic way of life which included abstinence from sexual intercourse, meat and wine, and they taught their adherents to resort to civil disobedience in their resistance to established ecclesiastical authority. The relationship of Bogomilism to the earlier and largely Armenian heresy of Paulicianism has been much debated, and there can be no doubt that the sects influenced each other. According to the Byzantine sources, including Anna Komnena's Alexiad, the Bogomils had spread by the late 11th century over the entire Balkan Peninsula and parts of Asia Minor. There were even adherents in aristocratic circles in Constantinople, led by a figure called Basil the Bogomil, who wore monastic clothing but probably came from Constantinopolitan professional classes. Alexios proceeded to arrest Basil and to question him in private, before condemning him to be burned. The emperor also commissioned a book called the Dogmatic Panoplia, or a description of heresies, to be compiled by Euthemios Zigabinos. This compendium, along with a work composed at the behest of Manuel I Komnenos, Andronikos Kamateros' Sacred Arsenal, reveals much about late 11th and 12th century attitudes towards heresy. A growing mood of intolerance to doctrinal outsiders, including not only dualists but also Jews, Muslims, and other earlier ideological adversaries, is evident in this period. Even judging by the hostile Byzantine sources, however, it is clear that Bogomilism and Paulicianism were extremely popular religious sects. It is worth reflecting on what, besides dualism, these groups had to offer to their adherents. Perhaps one of the most attractive aspects of Bogomilism and Paulicianism was their emphasis on ethical and ascetic ideals. In the face of an increasingly rich and powerful established Orthodox Church, represented by clergy who were engaged in an endless round of imperial ceremonial, the heretical sects offered an opportunity for lay involvement, probably with significant spiritual rewards. The Bogomils, like the early Paulicians, emphasized a return to New Testament ethics and inspiration in addition to the esoteric teachings of a dualist philosophy. Along with heretical movements, Orthodox holy men attracted a share of official disapproval in the 12th century. This new attitude is somewhat surprising when we think of the importance accorded to holy people engaged in solitary ways of life or even more eccentric behavior, such as standing on columns or wearing chains in early Byzantine society. Men with a vested interest in the established ecclesiastical or secular hierarchy began in this period to resent ascetics with few academic or spiritual credentials who attracted notice by their outrageous behavior. Various texts written by intellectuals such as John Tetzies and Eustathios of Thessalonica castigate the ostentatious and fraudulent practices of people whom they obviously regard as charlatans. During the reigns of the Komneni and the Angeli, and most especially during the reign of Manuel I Komnenos, the church hierarchy encouraged well-regulated cenobitic monastic life and frowned on more individualistic forms of religious piety. The lack of extant saints' lives from the 12th century further testifies to a decline in active or at least publicly recognized holy men. While late 11th and 12th century emperors may have been repressive towards heretics and unconventional would-be saints, this period is also characterized by an upsurge in literary production and patronage of the arts. The courts of the Komneni attracted intellectuals of all kinds, and in spite of such events as the trials of John Italos, this resulted in an increasing openness to rationalist and humanist theology. This is also the period in which genres of secular literature were revived after a period of decline. Historiography, the romances, and satirical poetry represent only a few examples. The combination of Enlightenment and repression in the 11th and 12th century Byzantine Church reflects a society which was on the verge of change, a transformation which was certainly hastened by the appearance of crusaders from the West.